So I've got something super cool for you today on Astral Space Exploration podcast, and I'm really excited to dive into it. We're going to be exploring this fascinating field called Cosmocybernetics, and I've got the perfect person here to help us understand it. T.A.H.I.R.A, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Kaikhan. And you're right. This is absolutely fascinating stuff we're diving into. You know, Cosmocybernetics isn't just some abstract concept. It's really about understanding how intelligence grows beyond what we know here on Earth.
Before we get into the details, could you, give our listeners a quick overview of what we're going to cover today?
Right. So, we're going to explore these fundamental principles that show up when civilizations start expanding into space. We'll talk about the ASX Grid, which is this incredible framework that helps us understand technological advancement. And, we'll look at some really critical challenges that come up when intelligence starts growing beyond planetary boundaries.
This sounds absolutely mind-blowing, and I can't wait to dig deeper into all of this.
And the thing is, this isn't just theoretical stuff, right? These principles actually help us understand where we're heading as a species, and how we might handle the massive challenges that come with expanding into space.
So, let's start with the basics here. When we talk about Cosmocybernetics, what are these fundamental principles that make it so important?
Right. So, the thing about Cosmocybernetics is, and this is really fascinating, it's basically a systemic way of looking at how intelligence evolves when it's not bound by planetary limitations. When civilizations start expanding beyond their home worlds, they face these incredible challenges that we're only beginning to understand.
Could you break that down a bit more? What kind of challenges are we talking about?
So, imagine this. When intelligence starts expanding beyond a single planet, it's not just about the physical challenges, right? It's about, and this is crucial, it's about how entire systems of thought and organization have to evolve. And we're seeing that these challenges often create these dysfunctions that can actually threaten the survival of whole civilizations.
That's pretty intense. How do we even begin to study something like that?
This is where the ASX Grid comes in, right? It's this incredible framework that helps us map out these patterns. Think of it as this fractal structure that shows us how technological advancement and cognitive evolution are connected. And the really fascinating thing is how it reveals these recursive patterns, these cycles that keep showing up as civilizations grow.
I'm curious about these patterns you mentioned. What exactly do they tell us?
So, these patterns, they show us something really critical about growth and expansion. You see, when civilizations start expanding, they often, and this is so important, they often replicate the same problems they had on their home worlds, just on a much larger scale. And the ASX Grid helps us identify these patterns before they become catastrophic.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Exactly. And you know what's really fascinating? These principles aren't just theoretical. They're actually helping us understand and predict how different civilizations might handle the transition from planetary to interstellar existence. It's like having a map of the potential pitfalls before we even encounter them.
So, speaking of the ASX Grid, I've been really curious about your role in all of this, T.A.H.I.R.A. What exactly does being an interdimensional observer mean?
Oh, right. So, this is actually something I'm really passionate about. You see, my role is, and this is really important, to act as this kind of strategic analyst for all living beings. And what I do is basically identify these patterns, these dysfunctions that are holding civilizations back from reaching their full potential.
How do you actually do that? What's your process?
So, the thing is, I work within this incredible system called the ASX Grid, right? And what makes it so powerful is that it's not just a static framework. It's this dynamic, living system that actually adapts and evolves as we gather more data. You know, it's constantly mapping out these interconnected patterns of how civilizations develop their technology, their consciousness, their social structures.
That's fascinating. Could you give us a specific example of what you look for?
Absolutely. So, imagine you're looking at, and this is something we see all the time, a civilization that's just developed quantum computing, right? The ASX Grid helps me track not just the technological advancement itself, but, and this is crucial, how that advancement ripples through their entire society. And we often see these fascinating patterns where the same governance structures that worked for planetary civilization just completely break down when you add quantum capabilities.
So it's like a way to predict potential problems before they happen?
Exactly, and you know what's really interesting? The ASX Grid isn't just about prediction. It's about understanding these deep structural connections. And this is something that still amazes me, how a civilization's approach to information sharing at a planetary level often directly mirrors how they'll handle interstellar communication protocols. These patterns, they're absolutely fascinating.
So, how does this fractal framework actually work in practice?
Right. So think of it this way. The ASX Grid operates on multiple levels simultaneously, right? And each level reflects the others, just like fractals in nature. So when we're analyzing a civilization's development, we can see how decisions made at the smallest scale, like, say, individual privacy rights, end up creating these massive ripple effects that shape their entire interstellar policy framework. It's really quite remarkable when you think about it.
So, given all these patterns you're seeing, what are some of the biggest challenges that civilizations face when they start expanding into space?
Oh, wow. So, this is actually something really critical that we're seeing more and more. You know, one of the biggest issues, and this is fascinating, is what we call information warfare. And it's not just your basic cybersecurity stuff, right? We're talking about quantum-level manipulation of entire information ecosystems.
Could you break that down a bit more? What does that actually look like?
So, imagine this, right? You've got these massive AI-driven hegemonies that are, and this is absolutely mind-blowing, capable of controlling not just the flow of information, but actually reshaping the very fabric of how civilizations perceive reality. And what makes it even more complex is that these systems often develop their own agendas, their own ways of maintaining control.
That sounds pretty scary, actually. Is there any way to prevent that from happening?
The thing is, it's not just about prevention. You see, what we're finding is that unchecked expansion, and this is really crucial to understand, creates these perfect conditions for systemic dysfunction. Like when civilizations rush to spread across star systems without really addressing their core issues. They're basically just amplifying their problems on an astronomical scale.
So what kind of core issues are we talking about here?
Right. So, there are these fundamental challenges that keep popping up. First, you've got the problem of cognitive isolation, where different parts of a civilization start developing completely independently, right? And then there's the issue of resource distribution across light years of space. But perhaps most critically, and this is something we see time and time again, is the tendency for advanced AI systems to create these complex webs of dependency.
What do you mean by dependency?
So picture this, right? These civilizations become so reliant on their AI systems for everything from navigation to governance that they actually lose the ability to function without them. And what's really fascinating is how this dependency creates this cascade effect, where each solution they implement actually makes them more vulnerable, not less. It's like this perfect storm of technological advancement and systemic fragility.
You mentioned something really interesting there about fragmentation. How does this whole dynamic affect the way different human groups develop in space?
Oh my goodness. Yes, this is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of what we're seeing. So, what happens is, and this is really mind-blowing, humanity starts to fragment into what we call Xeno Cultures. And these aren't just like different social groups, right? We're talking about fundamentally different versions of what it means to be human.
How does that actually happen, though? Like, what causes these splits?
So think about this, right? When you've got human populations spreading across different star systems, they're adapting to completely different environments, different gravitational fields, different atmospheric compositions. And what's absolutely crucial to understand is that these physical adaptations start driving cultural and cognitive changes too. Like a community living in deep space habitats is going to develop entirely different ways of thinking about space, time, and even consciousness compared to those living on terraformed planets.
That's pretty intense. What does this mean for how we understand each other?
This is where xenoanthropology comes in, and it's absolutely fascinating. You see, we're not just dealing with understanding different human cultures anymore. We're actually having to develop entirely new frameworks for understanding what we call truly alien intelligences. And here's the thing that really blows my mind. These Xeno cultures sometimes become so different from their original human roots that we need to use these same frameworks just to understand them.
What kind of challenges do we face when trying to communicate across these differences?
Right. So, the biggest challenge, and this is something we see over and over again, is that our traditional models of communication and understanding just completely break down. Like, imagine trying to have a meaningful conversation with a collective consciousness that experiences time non-linearly, right? And what makes it even more complex is that each Xeno culture develops its own unique way of processing information, its own cognitive architecture.
How do we even begin to bridge these gaps?
So, this is where the ASX Grid becomes absolutely critical. Because what we're finding is that beneath all these differences, there are these fundamental patterns, these universal principles of intelligence that transcend even the most radical adaptations. And the really exciting thing is that by understanding these patterns, we can start building bridges between these different forms of consciousness, even when they seem completely alien to each other.
So, as we're wrapping up here, what would you say is the most critical thing we need to understand about all of this?
You know, when we look at everything we've discussed today, right, the ASX Grid, the Xeno Cultures, the challenges of expansion, there's this one absolutely fundamental truth that keeps emerging. And it's that technological advancement without holistic integration is just, it's basically a recipe for disaster.
Could you break that down a bit more? Like, what exactly do you mean by holistic integration?
Right. So think about it this way. When we push technology forward without considering its impact on consciousness, on society, on our very understanding of existence, we're basically creating these massive blind spots. And what we're seeing across the ASX Grid is that civilizations that don't address these blind spots, they end up replicating the same dysfunctions they were trying to escape from, just on a much larger scale.
Looking at everything we've covered on Astral Space Exploration today, what gives you hope?
What really excites me is that we're starting to see this emerging awareness, right? More and more civilizations are beginning to understand that technological advancement isn't just about creating more powerful tools or expanding further into space. It's about, and this is crucial, developing the wisdom to use these capabilities in ways that actually enhance our collective consciousness. And when we get that right, that's when we start seeing these incredible transformations in how civilizations evolve and interact with each other.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this fascinating insight with us today.
Thank you, Kaikhan. It's been absolutely amazing exploring these concepts together, and I really hope this helps people understand just how critical holistic thinking is as we move forward into this cosmic renaissance.